spatially oriented information that is tremendously valuable for trying to interpret ecological patterns that we see. And so Kelly referred to the fact that all the changes in precipitation, temperature, the high flow years, the high snowpacks, the drought conditions that have been experienced in our experiences of daily life are magnified that much more by those organisms that don't live inside houses. And so that's kind of what I want to touch on with the work I want to talk about related to the organisms that live in streams and lakes and the implications especially of the drought conditions that we've had over the last couple of years. It's really unfortunate that we don't have the same kind of density of networks for monitoring ecological effects that we do those physical environment effects, because as you could see from Kelly's talk, there's a lot of spatial variation, even in sites that are relatively near one another, in the kinds of environmental regime that occurs during these conditions of either high wet years or drought years. Very often adjacent areas that are not too far apart will experience very different kinds of environments. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. But I think it's also a really important thing just to keep in the back of our minds in terms of the kinds of monitoring information that's out there that allows us to evaluate what the ecological consequences of these things are, that there's really very little of that that's out there. In the last few years, actually in the last decade or so, there has been a lot of energy devoted through NSF research programs to what's called NEON, the National Ecological Observation Network. And this is intended, when it gets to be fully functional, to be a system of monitoring stations, 20 stations throughout the country that allow some of this kind of highly detailed information about the responses of ecological systems, biological systems, to variation in the physical environment. But you could see from the network, the grid network that Kelly was talking about, that a network of 20 stations just sounds like nothing compared to the density of information that's there. So those of you who are associated with agencies that do any kind of monitoring, really important to bear in mind, that especially that if you're doing ecological monitoring of any kind, and maybe Connie will talk a little bit about Gloria, as another ecological monitoring network, how important that kind of information is to be able to interface with this highly detailed system of information that's developed from weather monitoring stations. So you often hear people talking about what happens in a normal year. This pattern or that pattern develops in a normal year. Well, we all know from living in California and or Nevada and the Great Basin that there really is no such thing as a normal year. We have a statistical average year, but what's abnormal conditions is typically the normal. We're often at one extreme or another. It's a land of extremes. And increasingly seems like we're headed in that direction. So these kinds of variations, these cyclical variations, either in the annual regime of snowfall, precipitation, temperature, that's what we already know of as a Mediterranean type climate, where we have mild, wet winters cycling into hot, dry summers. And again, increasingly, it seems that these swings will be much more in that kind of direction of seeing an exaggeration of those kinds of conditions. So the good part of that, ecologically, biologically, is that it means the kinds of organisms that live in these Mediterranean climates are adapted to those kinds of extremes. To what extent, though, are they adapted to those kinds of extremes? What's the extent to which we can expect to see organisms being able to respond to and continue to be able to tolerate and survive these conditions of extremes? So that's what I want to touch on with respect to what we've seen in a network of aquatic environments that we've been studying over the past 4 years in streams in the Sierra Nevada, as well as some of the Great Basin lakes, the terminal salt lakes, to which most of our eastern slope streams drain. I thought I might talk a little bit about this, but Kelly gave a much better set of information that just showed the kinds of contrasting snow water years that we've seen from 2010, 11, 12, and 13. Basically that we saw in the 2009, 2010, and 2010, 2011 years where we had very high precipitation, especially that 2010, 2011 condition, where we saw very high snowpack, very high runoff, cold temperatures, and then a swing to the other extreme in the last 2 years of these drought conditions. So what happened in streams and in lakes during these conditions? And the first thing that I want to go through with you is just the notion of conceptually, what sorts of changes do we expect to see and have we seen in headwater stream environments, in particular the sources of water that supply the essential flows to the aquatic ecosystems I'm going to be talking about, but also, of course, a critical economic resource to Great Basin states. There's a habitat compression that occurs, so that there's drying that's going on from above as snowpack is depleted, but there's also warmer conditions that are occurring below in these environments, so you essentially start to get this ecological vice of organisms being constrained to smaller and smaller habitat areas, especially during low late summer flows. But those confined environments are also environments that have increased temperatures in them and slower flows. So I want to go through with you some of the observations we've made about what the consequences are of this kind of ecological vice in headwater streams in the Sierra Nevada. So what happens in streams that are subjected to drought? And one of the first things we see is that with these low flows, we find a significant increase in the growth of algae as the area of the stream and its nutrients become concentrated. So I don't know if we have people who do fly fishing or who just love to go hang out by streams and do so regularly enough, but one of the common observations I heard from a lot of people that I met up in the backcountry or that go out to rivers regularly is how much algae they were seeing in the streams. And that's consistent with what we were observing in this network of headwater streams that we've been studying from the southern to the northern part of the Sierra. In addition to that, we saw that organic matter is also accumulating under these lower flow conditions. And by organic matter, what I specifically mean is that in most streams, there is dense riparian cover along the stream side, leaves, woody material that falls off that riparian. That riparian vegetation falls into the stream, starts to decompose, and also with high flow conditions and the consumption of that decomposing organic matter by the organisms in the stream, which, by the way, I will be focusing on in terms of the benthic invertebrates, the aquatic insects that live on the stream bottom primarily, this organic matter is chewed up by them to some extent, and it accumulates in streams under low flow conditions because there simply isn't sufficient power in the streams to flush that material out. So this organic matter, along with algae, is accumulating to relatively high levels in the stream under these low flow drought conditions. And so one of the important consequences of that is that along with elevated temperatures and the organic matter that's decomposing in the stream and the respiration that the algae require at night when they're not photosynthesizing means that the oxygen in the water is going to be sucked out. So we often will get anoxic conditions developing on stream bottoms under these low flow conditions, and that's a really important stressor that's going to be limiting to any aquatic life, whether it's aquatic invertebrates or fish. So again, lots of algae, lots of organic matter, elevated temperatures, and increased levels of decomposition that reduce dissolved oxygen level. In addition to there being a reduced capacity for organic matter to be flushed out under low flow conditions, we also see that sediments are going to be accumulating in streams. So for example, when we had very high flow regime occurring in the wet winter and wet year of 2011, there was a great deal of erosion occurring on the landscape, transporting sediments overland into streams and depositing those sediments. some transport, depending on the hydrodynamics of the particular stream reach you're talking about. But with drought years following that year of erosive activity from flows, it meant that those low flow conditions would fail to transport out sediments. So another important consequence of drought is that sediments are accumulating under these low flow conditions, so being deposited instead of transported. And that has the tendency to also produce stress on the organisms that live on the stream bottom, because it means that a lot of the habitat that they would otherwise be able to inhabit is getting buried by fine material and sandy material. That has the consequence of reducing the abundance and diversity of those organisms. So again, central to the ecological function of streams, the stream invertebrates are what are exposed most to these stressors. They are kind of the cog in the whole system, in that they are consuming the algae and organic matter that's the food base of the stream, but in turn they become a food resource to fish in the stream, amphibians in the stream, riparian birds that are so abundant and common along stream sides. And so it's really important to be examining their responses to these drought stresses. So what we see is that there are winners and there are losers. Many of the insects that you think of in streams, if you're a fly fisherman, are the insects that are the losers. These mayflies, stoneflies, caddisflies, they're very sensitive to rising temperatures, to stressors related to the loss of oxygen in the water, depleted flows, low flow conditions. And so you see those organisms disappearing, and overall the community, the diversity of the community is reduced as a consequence of that. There are some organisms that are stress tolerant though, and they become the winners. So there are organisms like worms and midge flies, typically small-bodied organisms that have a high tolerance to the stress of low oxygen conditions, and they're the winners, and they're the ones that we see increasing in abundance under these kinds of conditions. But with these swinging conditions, through the stress of drying conditions, the most severe condition in drought is when a perennial stream actually becomes converted to an intermittent stream. And so that's one of the things that we're really trying to track more carefully as a physical outcome of the kind of meteorological and long-term climate phenomenon that Kelly was talking about. So when a community is exposed to drying, when a community of organisms in these streams is exposed to drying, there's a real changeover in the diversity of organisms that are there and the types of organisms that are there. And that's one of the things that we saw in a lot of the streams that we have been working with in the Sierra and these headwaters. This ecological vice that's crunching from the top and the bottom of drying and warming goes to the extreme of streams going completely dry. And so the recovery of that kind of a community in a subsequent year when flows are returned is one of the things that we're really interested in looking at right now, because we've got these conditions where we can actually make some of those observations from the drying conditions we've had over the last couple of years to see what happens in a stream that's normally a perennial stream, that's typically a perennial stream, what happens when it's completely dry and then resumes flows. Does it get back the same kind of community that was there before, or is it depleted for a longer period of time in terms of its overall diversity and productivity and associated ecological services? And of course, in addition to the invertebrates being stressed, fish are also stressed, in particular by these warming conditions, these low flow conditions, and also by the fact that the quality and quantity of food they have available to them in the form of these aquatic invertebrates is also reduced, really depleted. So just as a bottom line then, these streams that are exposed to drought, they get green, brown, warm, stinky, muddy, and stressed. So that's the bottom line for a lot of the responses that we're seeing in those habitats. It's not true across the board though. As you saw from, again, Kelly's presentation, there can be real variations between the northern, central, southern Sierra Nevada, and even within those areas in terms of the kinds of responses that streams have to the changing environmental regime. So how about the saline lakes of the western Great Basin? What's been their response to drought? And we have been doing long-term studies at a number of lakes, not continuously, unfortunately, but at least with enough periods of record that we can discern what some of the changes are that are associated not just with the recent drought, but with long-term water depletion that's associated with the fact that the big swings in water cycles are truncated in many of these saline lakes, not just because of the natural cycle of climate, but because flows are depleted upstream by diversions. So in the case of Mono Lake, you probably all know this story, most famously. In Mono Lake, we started to see very rapid drops in lake level starting in about 1940, when all stream flow to the lake, or essentially all stream flow to the lake, was diverted into the Los Angeles Aqueduct. And what I've shown on this graph here are spots where there's particularly important salinity changes. So in the pre-diversion lake, you can see, and also one of the things about the pre-diversion lake is that the lake levels are fluctuating back here. So there's a natural range of variation that these saline lakes experience because of the kinds of climate variation that Kelly was talking about. But at the time that water diversions began, the salinity of the lake was about 50 grams per liter. For reference, seawater is 34. But of course, the chemistry of Mono Lake water and all these western Great Basin lakes is very different from seawater, highly alkaline as opposed to relatively neutral water because of the high dissolved concentrations of carbonates, bicarbonate, and sulfate. So at the time diversions began, salinity is about 50 grams per liter. At the low point of the lake, salinity was about twice that, at 100 grams per liter. And the mandated stabilization level, ordered by the State Water Resources Control Board, is at 6392 feet elevation, which is about 75 grams per liter. So what I want to show you here is just this kind of long-term trace of lake level by year, going all the way back to 1850, a drop in lake elevation of about 40 feet, and then we have other more recent changes, and I want to show you some of those. So more recently, from about 1976 through 2013, you can see that this is the change that we've seen in lake level. It's been a lot of fluctuation, some good years, some drought conditions, but at least in terms of what was expected to be occurring at the lake, according to the hydrologic projections, which unfortunately are just based on averaged models, the lake has not achieved its restoration goal of 6392. It was projected to have achieved that by the year 2014, by next year, the year in which there would also be a revisitation of the decision by the State Water Resource Control Board to re-examine how far have we come, how successful has this been as a restoration, not only of lake level and dust control, but also ecological restoration to the lake. So just to place this in context then, what do the droughts and what does the salinity and what does the variation in lake level mean to the ecological viability of the lake? So one of the things that we did back when an EIR was being prepared for the lake was a set of experiments that we did in big meisel kazem tanks. So these are tanks that are about 1 meter on a side and 1 meter deep that we filled with a half a cubic meter of water that we adjusted to varying salinities. They're kind of like, the experiment was a bit like a time machine. What we wanted to do was ask, what was the lake like back before diversions began, when it had a salinity of 50 grams per liter, and what was it like when it reached that very high salinity of 100 grams per liter, which it happened to be at the time we were doing this experiment, and what might it be like in the future were water diversions to continue and the lake level continue to drop and the salinities continue to rise. So what this is an experiment in which we looked at the output of these mesokazem tanks in terms of one of the really important organisms in the lake, for those of you who have been up to the lake, that's a food resource to birds, are alkali flies. So you walk down to the shoreline of the lake and there's big clouds, Lord of the Flies, when you get to the lake, and they're a really important food resource to shorebirds. and water birds in general that visit the lake. And so we wanted to ask the question, how much will the productivity of those flies be changing as a consequence of salinity and varying lake levels? And so what you can see here is that this was the historic pre-diversion salinity of the lake, at least at this point where I was pointing out it was at 50 grams per liter, which probably represents a relatively long-term average salinity for hundreds of years prior to that. And what you see depicted in these diagrams is, first of all, how much algae did the tank grow by this amount of material you see sitting in the tank, and then how many flies emerge from the tank by these flocks of flies up here. And then we have a little cutout for each of those individual flies that shows you both by the size of the pie how big the fly is and how much fat it has. So that's a way of depicting the relative food value of these individual flies, as well as the flies collectively, as a food resource to birds feeding at the lake. So what you can see is that as we go from 50 to 75 to 100 to 125 grams per liter, the lake never got down to this lake level, but as you can see, the army of flies that is emerging from the tanks becomes more and more reduced as the salinity goes up and the elevation goes down. And you can see that the size of the pie gets smaller, and the slice of fat in the pie also gets smaller. So where are we right now? You saw in that last graphic that because of the drought, the lake level has bumped back down, and it's not anywhere near where it would be at its restoration level, which is at about this salinity, 75 grams per liter. Actually, it would be slightly less than this because we're looking at being at 6392. But right now where we are is somewhere between 80 and 85 grams per liter. So somewhere between this level of productivity and this level of productivity. So what that means as an ecological consequence of the drought to Mono Lake is that it's very likely to be a less productive environment than it has been at a higher lake level and at a lower salinity. And that even at a stabilization salinity, it's not what it might be if it were at the salinity that it would be today under undiverted water conditions. One of the things I want to bring into this is just the fact that there are some climate models that have been produced relatively recently by, is it Deb Ficklin? What's her? Who's
Stewart's group, is that what you mean?
Yeah, Ficklin. Yeah. So anyway, there's a group that, there's a really good issue of the journal Climate Change that came out not too long ago that had some models that were specific to the Eastern Sierra and to different basins. So for the Mono Lake Basin, the projection is of modeling results of climate change. They suggest that there's a significant hydrologic response by the end of century, so we're talking about years and years out, but a gradually occurring progressive change that indicates we'll see a decrease in annual stream flow by 15% compared to historic conditions, an advance in the peak snowmelt runoff to 1 month earlier, conditions that would be where runoff would occur in June and May rather than June, and a decreased occurrence of wet hydrologic years by 10 to 15%, more frequent drought conditions by an average of about 20%. So basically, the ecosystem health, water diversions, they may be affecting reduced water availability, but it's likely also that we'll see in a changing climate scenario that there will continue to be a reduced water availability to Mono Lake and likely other Eastern Sierra waters simply because of the changing climate regime. So how about Walker Lake out in Nevada? Here's a lake that's dropped about 150 feet since upstream water diversions began for agriculture about a little over a century ago. And here's the more recent changes in lake level above and salinity below. So right now we're seeing that the community of organisms that are Walker Lake are at a threshold of salinity stress. We see that under conditions where the salinity of the lake was about 10 to 15 grams per liter, down in this range here, about half seawater concentration. There were abundant populations of an amphipod that you see in this graphic above, as well as lahont and cutthroat trout. Those have both now disappeared, and what remains in the lake as abundant populations are this midge, this damselfly, and the tui chub. And based on salinity, salt tolerance bioassays that we've done on these organisms, we're seeing that right now, somewhere just above 20 grams per liter is where we are seeing there will be salinity limitations on the survival of this midge, which is the food resource to this damselfly, which is in turn the food resource to this tui chub. So as physiological limitations kick in at this lake, occurring in the very near future, as a consequence of the absence of inflows coming into that lake and climate change as well, we're likely to see the disappearance of these organisms and the replacement of organisms in this lake, much more like the kind of community of organisms that we see in Mono Lake. So the native community of organisms that exist in this lake is on the threshold of collapse. Abert Lake up in southern Oregon has passed its ecological threshold of salinity stress just this last year. A much shallower lake that as little as 2 years ago has very healthy populations of aquatic life in its waters and supported a brine shrimp fishery, supported hundreds of thousands of water birds, including ducks, visiting this lake. And now the brown shrimp, even the brine shrimp and alkali flies that are salt adapted have disappeared from this lake at a salinity of greater than 150 grams per liter. Another lake that has upstream water diversions going on. Owens Lake is a place where in the distant past, Owens Lake unfortunately is a place where the lake has passed out of human memory as being a lake by and large. However, because of dust control needs, the Department of Water and Power has had to rewater a lot of the area of this lake, and it has once again recovered many of its ecological values. Many of the ecological values of this lake are in its shallow water nearshore environment, known as the littoral environment. It's within this shallow, light exposed area of the lake that there's lots of lake bottom algae that grow. Those algae in turn serve as a food resource, again, to organisms like the alkali fly and become a very productive place for bird life. This is what the lake looked like back about a century ago. This is the littoral habitat around here. This is what it looks like today. That littoral habitat has actually been expanded greatly compared to what it was even a century ago in the natural lake. And this area of flood irrigated water for dust control now has a great deal of habitat recovered. The salinity still needs to be managed to optimize what that is. But this productive littoral zone of algae and insects attracts lots of water birds. And so the bottom line is that these environments are recoverable. They can be recoverable. These organisms can recolonize. And even if it's not an intentional recovery, we can get these habitats back if we just add water. So to end things here, and I'll just take a few minutes of this, is to try and bring it back into the community. What can we do as scientists and as data providers to foster involvement with our community and provide information to local resource and regional resource management agencies to be helpful, to be able to promote this information both in the community and make it useful to management agencies. So one of the things we're doing right now is working with high school, groups of high school students both in Mammoth and in Bishop on a project where we're looking at the relationship of stream flow to water chemistry. And we've got about 25 or so students involved in the project. It's a project that is really experiential science. It's a way of bringing students into a research environment where they're doing question-driven science, and there's a motivation for them to be discovering new information. And that's exactly what this project is all about. We're trying to answer questions that we don't have the answers to right now. And so it's been a really exciting opportunity to work with the community, get students involved and aware of local resource issues, and in particular under these drought conditions, this has generated some really interesting data and engaged a good group of students, and has also been an opportunity to interact with the LA Department of Water and Power, because they have been really great about providing information on stream flow in many of the streams we're doing work on. So a great way to interconnect agencies, scientists, and students. We've also been very active in trying to develop and contribute technical data to help inform decision making by the forest management process that's going on right now in our own Inyo National Forest, and help them develop their assessment report, and in addition to that, to contribute original research to help them make decisions about resource management issues that they're dealing with right now, like livestock grazing. So because I'm out of time, I think I'll stop talking.